Okay, if everybody could take their seats, we're going to start the next panel. Well, for all of you who have attended many of these sessions in the past, you know when you see me up here, it must be the international panel. We're going to talk about Humpty Dumpty here, which is really just code for talking about whether or not we have one internet or we're going to have multiple internets. What do we have today? What are we going to have down the road? I'm going to begin by quoting the Bible. And in the case of international telecommunications, that Bible is the World Summit on the Information Society, which had its first phase back in 2003. And at the beginning of this Heads of State UN Summit, and in the UN world, Heads of State Summits are the pinnacle, they began the statement with the following: "We, the representatives of the peoples of the world," can't get much more pretentious and inclusive than that, "we, the representatives of the people of the world, assembled in Geneva for the first phase of the World Summit on the Information Society, declare our common desire and commitment to build a people-centered, inclusive, and development-oriented information society where everyone can create, access, utilize, and share information and knowledge, enabling individuals, communities, and peoples to achieve their full potential in promoting their sustainable development and improving their quality of life, premised on the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and respecting fully and upholding the Universal Declaration of Human Rights." Boy, it doesn't get any better than that. And look at where we are today, just a few 15 years later or so. That commitment to sort of a singular internet has been part of U.S. foreign policy for many, many years. It was during the Clinton administration. It was during the Bush administration. The Obama administration went so far as to have an international strategy of cyberspace in which they declared that the global internet would be, quote, "open, interoperable, secure, and reliable." That commitment was more recently reaffirmed by the Trump administration back in 2018, saying that it was committed to an open, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet, virtually the identical language of the Obama administration. I think most people looking around the world today say they have serious questions about whether or not the internet is singular or plural, whether it's open or not, whether it's secure or not, and the like. We're going to hear from our four panelists today. We're just going to go straight down the line here. Each one's going to give very brief opening remarks. Then we'll go immediately into Q&A as well. Fiona Alexander.
Sure. So thanks for the invitation, and it's nice to hear the WSIS text come back. It was 5 years of my life. I got to spend so much time with David, though. But yeah, it was a very interesting exercise that we went through. So I'm going to argue that the words "the internet," and I still argue that it's a capital I, it is not a lowercase I, just to be clear. The internet.
You might want to explain why that actually matters.
Because it's a network of networks. It's not a singular thing. And so that's why all this text that David referenced, whether it was the WSIS text or the text from the four administrations that I had the pleasure of working in, I would say is still consistent, because it was never about having a single network. It was about having a single network of networks that interconnected. So interoperability was always key. So we always focused on making sure that there was interconnection regimes, interoperability of the systems, and this exercise too is about the lower layers of the network. So you're talking about open voluntary standards, you're talking about an authoritative root zone and a singular domain name system to keep things running. But what we've seen and what we're seeing now, and we're seeing increasingly more of, is as the challenges of tech policy go up the layers of the network, it becomes harder and harder to convince governments that it's important to kind of keep the network open and keep the data free flowing, because governments are struggling with policy choices, not just governments around the world, but governments in the United States, which we've been talking about for the last day and a half. And for good policy reasons or bad policy reasons, depending on your perspective, governments are increasingly putting restrictions on these data flows to deal with the public policy challenges they have. And so as, in my previous job, as we would go around and try to talk to countries, both bilaterally and multilaterally, and explain the benefits of an open global internet and keeping things interconnected, it becomes harder and harder to prove that to them because of the economics. And I thought the panel yesterday morning was particularly interesting because we don't have the data to prove it anymore. And we went through this exercise, and you referenced the work that BEA and Census are doing, and that's all part of the work that NTI was doing because we had an internal commerce internet policy task force. In fact, NTI pays for a lot of that data collection, which keeps getting cut in the budget, by the way, if you want that data. And the point was, how do you actually measure these things, and how do you go to a country and say, I understand your concerns are X, but if you go down this path to solve your policy problem this way, it's going to cost you this much money in your GDP, and you're going to lose this much. And we just don't have the data to prove that. And it's becoming increasingly more and more of a challenge, I think, to make this argument to people, which I think others will talk about. And then I think as you go further up the layers of the network and you deal with the Section 230 stuff and social challenges and hate speech, it becomes even more of a problem for the United States government because you talk about multilateral, bilateral engagement on these issues, and you're talking about governments making a commitment, the very lofty statement that Ambassador Gross read about what governments agree to do. And if the US government makes those kind of statements with respect to content issues, you butt up right immediately with the First Amendment. So it puts whatever administration it is in a very difficult position to engage in those conversations. So I think these challenges just become increasingly harder for the United States as time progresses.
Let me follow up, and keeping your old hat on, not your new academic hat, but your old hat on. How important is it to the United States, from a governmental perspective, that we have a singular internet in terms of its interoperability and the ability to have free flow of information across borders? Is this something that people just sort of parrot because we used to say it, or is this something that's still important?
I think it's something that's still important and evidenced by the fact that you can get 4 administrations via interagency conversations and the White House to publicly come out and say this is important. It's important for trade policy. And as we look at putting in the new trade agreements have a digital services chapter. Like, this is an important part of our economy. Like, I'm not the analyst here, but a huge part of the U.S. economy is relying now on these digital services. So having a system that allows for this exchange of data and the growth of this technology is fundamentally important to the United States.
Perfect. Chris?
Yeah, so I think the comment about layers is important. To the question of, do we have a fractured internet? Because in some sense, I think that on the technical architecture side, we still have a relatively singular one. My background, my entree into tech policy was through ICANN, and it seems to me, even though I've been a little less active in that space recently, they've successfully staved off a lot of the threats to the domain name systems technical architecture. So whether that's the Dono project at the ITU or the Yeti project, sort of a Chinese-driven way to augment the numbering system and potentially insert an alternative route. Those seem to be managed threats that aren't going to really supplant ICANN's dominance and the technical DNS. But I'd say definitely on the content and services side, and by services, I mean data policy, things like cybersecurity policy, privacy issues, privacy policy. Absolutely, there's definitely a diversification, a fracturing of how countries are approaching this. I think Scott originally extended this invitation to my colleague Xiaomeng Lu, who's our China practice lead. She's great, quoted in the New York Times. She couldn't be here today, so you get me. I'm situated in Singapore. So I thought I'd draw on a few relevant examples from Asia to add some color to why I think there is this fracturing. So obviously you've got China as one pole, and it is I think the most ardent example of a country that's really staved off its own internet. There's extreme censorship of content. They've had long-time localization provisions for data. So that's, that's one example. On the content and data policy side, though, around Asia, you've got a patchwork of different approaches that different countries are taking forward. So take on the content side, a place like Thailand, it has late majest laws that prohibit any type of criticism of the Thai monarchy, and they're rigorously enforced, especially under the existing, essentially military government. In Singapore, you've had movement forward on the Deliberate Online Falsehoods Act this year. It's a bill to remove those if and when the state determines it's necessary. And in Australia and New Zealand, in response to the Christchurch attacks and the content that was streamed live, you've got some pretty strong bills to regulate content and stop that type of violent content from being put over platforms. And then on the data policy side, and especially on the localization question, you've got countries like Vietnam that have moved forward with their cybersecurity law that has some egregious localization provisions, though that they have gotten a little bit better over the course of the implementation of that law. India is in the midst of considering a draft data protection law that has some really strident localization provisions. Even Japan has come up with suggested localization provisions for certain types of critical information infrastructure. So, across the panoply of political dynamics and governments, you've got a real range of approaches. And then I would say that alongside that, you do have, I think, a concerted effort among stakeholders to get to that question of interoperability. And so this is happening at all different levels. Take Japan again, Abe's push to leverage the G20 to promote data free flow with trust, and maybe my colleague here will talk a bit about that. We're also seeing it at the ASEAN level. This is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. They have released earlier this year a data governance framework, and that's evolving, and there's been a lot of industry activity to inform how that evolves. And these are things like data classification regimes and what types of data is deemed sensitive versus non-sensitive, and the types of sharing of protocols for that type of data. And then at the national level, you've got a lot of just one-on-one industry engagement and stakeholder engagement, and that has been actually producing results. So take the Vietnam cyber law, it was kind of strong-armed through by their security agency, and there has been, I think, a walk back of this over time, over the last couple months, and it's at a place where I think most companies, if you're not a major social media giant, are comfortable with the way the localization provisions are set. I will say, this is the last point, the internet governance discussion has always been part substance, but also part process. And I also think that in Asia, there has been a movement towards more multi-stakeholder consultation, governance. Obviously, some countries do that more than others, but even in China, and perhaps this is something that's coming out from the pressure of the trade and tech war, they are becoming more open to taking on industry dialogue and feedback and modifying their laws accordingly. So there are lots of different movements, but it's going in a couple directions at once.
Well, you talk a little bit about lots of different movements. In the countries in Asia, let's just focus on that since you're based in Singapore for a moment. Do you see, when governments are trying to figure out what policies, what laws they should enact, do they look to the United States? Do they look to China? Do they look organically at their own civil society and companies and the like? I'm sure it's a combination, but where do they primarily go to understand and figure out how to best regulate this area?
Yeah, it is a combination, David. There's a couple things happening. One, I think the Chinese approach is ascendant, absolutely, in terms of cybersecurity, and they're using that as a wedge issue because there is an obvious role for government on cybersecurity issues. So a lot of countries that are contemplating how do we protect our citizenry effectively are thinking, well, actually, maybe the China model isn't so bad to have strong government controls and being able to designate something as secure or insecure. As a colleague based in Hanoi mentioned to me when I was there, the Vietnamese government wants hair to pull. And that's an expression that I think resonates with a lot of governments in Asia. There's also been, I think, a little bit of a degradation in kind of moral authority from the United States, at least as it's politically perceived in Asia, so that there's, I think, maybe less looking towards the US, and that's for a number of reasons, everything going back to Snowden and the disclosures there, to fraying, I think, ties with the current administration or a lack of understanding of how to manage it. And then in other areas, you've got GDPR as this outstanding sort of globalized extraterritorial regulation that has drawn a lot of interest across privacy regulators in Asia. I think a lot of governments are trying to find out what are the best elements and contextualize them for their country. Some are doing it better than others. So on one side, you've got India, drew on a lot of different things in its data protection law. I think a lot of people would think they didn't necessarily draw on all the best things to do that. And on the flip side, staying in the data protection space, you've got the Japanese model, which effectively was able to marry an agreement with a mutual adequacy agreement, the first one of its kind with the EU, so that data can flow back and forth between Japan and EU member states. But Japan has also been a big proponent of APEC and the cross-border privacy rules system. So they're attempting to kind of do both at the same time. Most of our clients and industry players, I think, would prefer a Japanese type of approach that draws on better elements from whether it's the EU or the US, and frankly, pushes back on some of the Chinese approach.
That's a great intro for Masa.
Hi, Gross-san. Thank you for inviting me today. It is my great honor to join the TPI panel today. Personally speaking, this is my first time in my life to be the panel. So I'm afraid to say, but I cannot make funny joke like you guys. Let me introduce myself and my company first. My name is Masahiko Nittono, Washington representative of NTT Holding. My name Masahiko is very complicated, even for Japanese, so please simply call me Masa. But the problem is there is another famous Masa in Japanese tech industry. Masa-son, SoftBank CEO.
Yeah.
So please officially call me Masa number 2. Number 3, number 4 is okay, fine with me. My company, NTT, is a Japanese telecom company. We originally provide fixed line, mobile, and ISPs domestically. But now we are providing ICT services, data center, and global IP backbone services all around the world. Our global revenue outside Japan exceeds more than 9.3 billion every year. And also we have network coverage in more than 190 countries and regions. Our global footprint is 89 countries. And also we have the largest data center capacity in the world. And finally, and surprisingly, NTT hires more than 30,000 employees only in the United States. Because of its global scale, NTT is always paying enough attention to the continued growth of digital global economy. Unfortunately, when we look at the digital economy of the world today, we can see the fragmentation of rules and regulations around the world, such as privacy and data localization. As a result, just ahead of G20 in Osaka in this June, NTT, together with major corporations around the world, proposed that the private sector and the government should work together to promote the continued growth of the digital economy. NTT had played an important role in compiling the recommendation to promote the free flow of data across national borders and to protect data localization based on local regulatory locations. NTT believes that data free flow is very important, and also data governance is also equally important. So we should work together to make data free flow compatible with data security.
Thank you. When you talk about that free flow of information across borders, and Chris also
Yes.
touched on that as well, from your perspective, Masa, where should those rules be designed? Should they go, are these bilateral discussions? Are they multilateral discussions? Should they be done through the ITU or WTO, the UN generally? How do you see that being discussed?
I would say one good example is cybersecurity. Governments have periodically discussed cybersecurity with each other and successfully implemented their cybersecurity policies. On the other hand, private sector also cooperated together to establish new framework and rules. So in fact, NTT has been led the dialogue on cybersecurity, not only countries in Japan, but also overseas companies. So in terms of data free flow, there are various opinions and definitions in each country. And I think we should establish a consensus from scratch. As a private sector, we should encourage each government to promote data free flow. Additionally, we should promote dialogue and cooperation among our private sectors. Once we should establish a consensus among private sectors, then international organizations such as ITU will be able to reach conclusion easily. This is my opinion.
Very good. Thank you. Shane?
So I think your opening comments were very good because I think we're still struggling with, can we agree on a set of foundational principles to manage the internet? And right now I feel like we are at both an economic, political, and social values that have been created over the past 3 decades are all at risk. One country that Chris didn't mention in his numerous of countries that are doing this is Russia. So Russia's President Putin signed a bill into law on May 1st that would require all internet traffic to be routed through government-controlled servers. And so this measure basically says they have to install equipment on the Russian web traffic, and then it's also on any equipment that is sold in Russia, so it follows you. So it's not going to happen just while you're in Russia. It's going to happen if you have a cell phone that you purchased in Russia and anywhere you go. So I think we're at a really interesting point because I think we've always thought that the internet was here to stay in the free and open way that we have grown up with it. And I think that's all being challenged right now. And we really need to think about that because there's an existential split over the way the internet has emerged between nations. And Chris, you're seeing it on a much more local level. We're reading a lot about it. But I think that these are very good questions that we're going to be discussing today.
Sure. Well, let me follow up a little bit, and this will be for everybody, but Shane, if you could start off. What's driving that? Is it the growth of social networks and the information that governments don't like to see? Is it cybersecurity related issues that seem to affect and infect everyone on an ongoing basis? What is it that's driving this change between the vision that we had, as I quoted back in 2003, of a fairly unified, idealized now in retrospect, internet, to today's internet, which seems to be very country-specific?
I think just in today's news cycle, we're seeing both Twitter and Facebook trying to take down as much disinformation as they can about what's going on in Hong Kong. And we're also seeing the counter side of that there's a lot of news reports saying how quickly there are Chinese news reports that are getting thrown onto social media as quickly as possible. So we're definitely in a challenge point about that. A counterpoint to that, though, is for those of us who travel a lot internationally, you realize that Facebook is truly the point of the internet for a lot of social things. If you're going to look for a restaurant, a lot of places don't actually have their own websites. Their point of presence is on Facebook. So it's a level of information that is available. I don't think that, we see so many of different places that we can get information in the United States that we don't understand how strong the social media is in other countries.
And related to that, as you travel around the world, when people often talk about the internet, they really are talking about particular specific sites like Facebook as being basically one and the same. Chris?
Yeah, it's funny. I was in a conversation with a Vietnamese regulator, and he blamed Facebook.
That's funny, always.
He blamed Facebook for the death of pregnant women in Vietnam. That's the extent of antipathy and antagonism.
What does that mean? Why would he say such a thing?
The way he described it was that there were bad health suggestions being promulgated on the platform that could maybe injure a pregnant woman, and so it's their fault.
Right.
And at the same time, on the you asked what is driving it. On the content side, it's one in a place like Vietnam or China, very political, or Russia for that matter. But it's also cultural. So that sort of plays into the Thai thing. In Indonesia, obviously heavily Muslim country, there are prohibitions on certain types of content. And on the data side of things, it's both of those as well, but it also incorporates, I think, interest by certain governments to promote their local industry. So places like India or Indonesia have very strong sort of populist policy approaches to empowering local business and industry, and they see the putting up walls around either their country or their networks as a way to drive investment into local technology, whether it's cloud service farms or telcos or what have you.
But isn't the counter that to potentially disconnect their citizens?
I mean, and that's what happens because companies can't come in at a cost point that is as easily to manage. So, one of the examples I draw on a lot, and drew on when I was in India last year talking about the data protection bill, was a really fascinating South-South growth story. So back in 2014, we interviewed a company in Indonesia that had never advertised online. It was 30 people. It only operated in Jakarta. And now it just passed the decacorn threshold. So that company is Gojek. And when we interviewed them, they were right in the process of building all their cloud architecture and their app and everything that goes along with it in India using Indian engineers. And they did that because it was cheap, and those guys had the capabilities, and they could move the data back and forth between Indonesia and India very easily. They ended up actually acquiring a number of those researchers and those engineers in Bangalore, and so that's now part of the Gojek company. And this is an example where if the localization law that had been promulgated in 2014 in Indonesia had been enforced, Gojek wouldn't have been able to do this, or wouldn't have been able to do it at a cost point that may have allowed them to grow the way they did. And India is now in the process of making that same consideration. Does it put up these types of walls?
Yeah, so Fiona, from your perspective, you mentioned a little bit about the lack of current metrics that has inhibited U.S. advocacy in this area. And Chris was just talking a little bit about the economic impact of the internet. Not very long ago, one of the main talking points for the U.S. government was to encourage the deployment of internet, but particularly broadband, finding some World Bank statistics that basically correlated the growth of broadband and internet to GDP growth. Are we still seeing that, or is there now a disconnect between that we've now hit a tipping point that it really doesn't have that same sort of impact?
So I would say it still has that same sort of impact, right? And when you're talking about, suggesting and encouraging and, ITU goals for universal connectivity, or the UN or whoever's putting them out, the Sustainable Development Goals, about getting everyone connected, at that layer, everyone is still very focused on how do you do that, how do you work that together. Where these challenges are occurring are this next layer. And my view is that, I think Shane's right, the system that we've taken for granted is under threat, but it's always under threat. And this is just the next phase of that threat. And you had asked what's driving governments. It's what always drives governments: money, or economics, security, and control. And these are three things that were never built into the internet, right? So every internet policy problem, I think, at some point sources back to the internet was not developed originally for what it's used for today. So there was never a charging regime. There were never security designs into it. And there was never quality of service designs into it. And so all the challenges that have then followed it come from the original design in some fashion, from my perspective.
Well,
Quickly,
Chris.
David, on the measurement issue, I think the correlation between growth of internet and growth of GDP is still there, absolutely. But there is a lack of investment in new studies around some of these other areas, like the impact of localization. And in part, it's just hard to do that type of work because there's not a lot of cases to draw on, kind of the counterfactual that you can do statistical analysis against. And survey methodology with companies, are probably not going to produce that easy results. And so it becomes very expensive. And we talk to economics firms about trying to do this, and the cost, even, the most well-pocketed and resource companies haven't really kind of invested in this. And there are a couple of new studies out there. I think Salesforce just came out with one that develops an index for looking at the value of cross-border data flows. But it's definitely an area that is still ripe for additional review, and one that could potentially help move the debate in a more productive fashion.
So we tried to do this, right? I mean, as the U.S. government, through the Department of Commerce, working with other agencies and trying to do all this data collection. We also tried to do it through the OECD. The OECD was very keen through the Digital Economy Committee to kind of look into all of this. And what it kept coming down to is the lack of information. Yeah. And no one could convince companies to share their data.
Yeah.
That's what it came down to in both exercises. So.
Masa, NTT, as you point out, is one of the largest companies in the world focusing on these very issues. It operates around the world, not just in Japan.
Yes.
Has huge data centers. Is this trans-border issue a real problem from your perspective?
Yes. One example which NTT is facing today is data localization, as you guys talk. As Gross-san said, NTT is the largest data center operator in the world. We are operating global-scale data centers in the world's most cost-effective location and delivering world-class quality of services and cost. However, in some Asian countries, data localization has been legalized, and all data must be stored and operated within those countries. And data cannot be taken out of their borders. As a result, our company needs to build a local-scale data center in those countries, which would not benefit from the economies of scale. And therefore, companies in those countries will not be able to enjoy the global standard of services quality and cost. As a result, it will be huge cost on the people of those countries, and there will be a risk that will disturb the fair growth of digital economy in those countries.
Thank you.
Just a question
Chris?
for Masa. Is that always the case? I know that within some companies, they see it as a market opportunity, and you guys being the world's largest data center operator, do you sometimes feel tension between your business guys who are saying, oh yeah, the localization is fine because then it'll drive more sales for our data centers in this country, vis-a-vis the sort of the more idealistic sort of policy argument around the challenge that presents from an overall business standpoint?
It's a good question. Actually, there is a pros and cons in data localization. As a global-scale data center services, the problem is we cannot provide very good quality services for those countries. Yeah, that is our challenge.
Yeah.
Shane, do you have a view on this data localization, which is obviously a very big issue, and it's been an issue now for a number of years? You talked a little bit about Russia and the like. What's really driving that? There's a lot of controversy. Part of it had to do with security. Part of the focus was a post-Snowden concern about the ability of the U.S. and other governments and their intelligence agencies to be able to access information stored in the United States or elsewhere. What's really driving that now? Because there's also, as we just heard, there's an economic component to it as well as a security.
Control. I think it's completely control, and nation states wanting to have control over the flow of information, and as well as some of them that want to really know everything that their citizens are doing. I'm a big believer, since I've lived in Washington for a long time, that pretty much everything I do is an open book. I mean, it's like they want to listen to my conversation.
We have all seen your Facebook page.
Right. But I agree with, I concur with one of the things that Fiona said in the beginning, which is I also believe that there should be a capital I on the internet because it is the network of networks. And what we're seeing is a fragmentation of that, which is very disconcerting. at many levels. There's a reason why it has worked as well as it has, and as we start to mess with that process, we don't really know how much the breakage will take place. And so we're seeing, you mentioned Vietnam, Chris, that there's certain things they've wanted taken down because they just don't like it. And it's not that there's a law against it. They'll contact one of the social media companies and be like, we don't agree with you. Take that down. So we start to let people's opinions, roll into how the networks work. We're having a lot of these discussions in the United States, but we're also a big believer in First Amendment rights. That we expect there to be some good discourse which has dialogue, but it's all allowed to be taken out in the open. I think we're going to see more and more of this be closed in certain governments, and I think that's really detrimental.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think, and this is a question for everybody, but I'll start with Shane. There's this political dimension, there's an economic dimension, and obviously there's a public policy set of dimensions as well that are quite legitimate. We see that in things like privacy issues and the like. Looking down the road, is it inevitable that we're just going to have this, what's sometimes referred to as splinternet, or other times referred to as a balkanization of the internet? Or do you think that actually that the value of having interoperability and the benefits that come to people and the governments will predominate?
I think that the ability for technology to run so much of the economy in multiple countries it's hard to put that back in the box. So I think we're going to, hopefully we're going to see this continue to progress. One thing I guess that just comes to mind is, I know the Gates Foundation did a study, I think with WEF, about how much of an economic driver the ability to have technology has been in areas like Africa and South America, which we don't focus as much on. In Africa specifically, they were talking about how they can take the dollar amount of things that are for a low income provided directly into a bank account, especially for women. And it allows that element of control that it would be transferred to their father or their husband, and they would not see those dollar amounts in an ability to raise and take care of their family. They're starting to see a net positive effect on that. So there's certain things that we don't necessarily think about when we're thinking about freedom of speech, but the financial element of what the internet has brought to bear. And we're seeing that also in the agricultural economy, where they're able to use combination of mobile apps to make sure that they're sending products to produce to where they're actually needed in the marketplace and not overburdening certain areas with things that they already have too much of and other places where they're not arriving, as well as with transportation. So you can use kind of an Uber-esque type model to make sure that your truck is full, both on the coming and the going to the marketplace. So I think there's so many layers to what this technology has brought into the economy that it's just something that hopefully everybody will want to keep flowing.
Mm-hmm. Fiona, one of the things that you've spent a lot of time working on is the cybersecurity related issues associated with that. And obviously, there's a strong view that that's getting worse and worse over time. A lot of focus on 5G and the question about whether or not that's going to have a materially potentially adverse impact on people's lives and the economics associated with the internet. We see a lot about Huawei, for example, and the U.S. government's concern about that. How do you see this playing out over time? Is this something where industry and others are going to be able to lead to a safer, more secure internet future, or is this just going to continue to be a cat-mouse game with governments being very, very concerned about it?
So I think my answer would be a little bit of both. First of all, there's always going to be a core group of countries that are authoritarian in nature that are always going to be seeking control, whether it's Russia or others. So you're always going to have that sort of group of countries that pursue that no matter what you do. And so the question becomes, how do you take the middle group of countries that are worried about economic development, that see the benefits that can come with it, but are now concerned about some of these more social policy issues, and how do you help solve those problems so they're more comfortable going down the path that the U.S. has historically gone down? And that's always been the challenge, I think, that we faced, which is how do you build a coalition, and how do you build a coalition of people that share the perspective and the values of a free and open internet and the democratic and based society versus those that don't. So I think it's not going to go away. It's how intense is the threat going to be, and I think it's going to ebb and flow. And I do think how we collectively figure out how to deal with some of the issues of hate speech or responsibility and accountability. And I was listening yesterday to the conversation. I was pointing out to someone, it's always been interesting to me because in the ICANN space, accountability and transparency are like the buzzwords and things we've talked about for a long time. I've done this work for 18 years. It was 12 years before someone told me there's no word in French for accountability. And my colleagues in Japan have the same concern. So like there's not a translation there in that space. So you've got to find ways to have conversations with people to try to help solve these problems. So again, not a clear answer, but I think the reality of what's in front of us.
Well, can I just also add the Egyptians were the ones that pointed out to us at the Internet Governance Forum that there is no word for government.
Yeah.
Yes, that one too.
And we were like, well, that kind of screws the pooch here. We're sitting here talking about
means
governance,
government,
and they're
right?
like, government, right? Like, no, yeah.
Right.
David, I was just going to say, I mean, as I mentioned, I think the cybersecurity is a wedge issue in terms of this debate. And it's one where you do actually have, I think, a lot of those middle-of-the-road governments really struggling to understand what can we do? We have to do something. And some obviously are considering the Chinese approach. Others are looking to the U.S. Others are looking to Europe. But there are efforts, and I'll just emphasize, to understand what the different options are, and how do you actually implement those. So in Asia, there are lots and lots of capacity building efforts around cybersecurity policy, and these are everything from bilateral engagements. So the Japan government is out supporting different engagements like the Japan-ASEAN Cybersecurity Center in Bangkok. Singapore has its own cybersecurity center of excellence. The Australians are out doing that. And industry is too. We run a small coalition called the Coalition for Cybersecurity in APAC. And one of the things we've been out doing is trying to have these conversations, draw on best practices around cybersecurity, because Asia really sits at the nexus of, do we go down a China route or do we go down a more risk-based, in some ways business-friendly, but also a governance model that understands it's not just about control, that there are legitimate technical issues that have to be considered, legitimate policy issues. And industry has been an active voice in this and getting involved in that capacity building as well.
While we're hopefully going to be able to put up our Slido questions, if somebody can help us do that, that would be great. Encourage everyone to use that process to ask your questions. While we're waiting for that, are we seeing another manifestation through the issues we're talking about of a transition from the Washington consensus that so dominated international policymaking, the Washington consensus being liberalization, privatization, and competition as the driver, and less regulation and traditional command and control, that we saw during the 70s and 80s and somewhat through the 90s as well, and now we seem to have a backsliding. On the internet, are we seeing basically just a manifestation of that, where you see increased government control from a top down as compared to the vision of the internet, which at its core was this information should be free, connection should be free, there should be no governmental rules whatsoever? Is that what we're seeing? Shane?
I think it's a backslide. I think that information flow is always a challenge for a government who wants to have control over their citizens.
Fiona, when you were part of these intergovernmental discussions, is that what you're seeing as well?
I think so. I think, as Washington struggles with what's the right way to handle these issues, and, it's interesting that there's bipartisan people on both sides of, if you want to call it the techlash. It's not like one party has one view and one has the other. It's interesting to watch how that shakes out. And I think as the Washington crowd in D.C. and the U.S. struggles to find what the right answer is, it becomes very hard for the U.S. to lead others in a solution set. So absolutely.
Right. And Masa, from your position, having been from Japan, now living in Washington, the vision that we talked about just now is sort of very core to both the U.S. and to Japan. The idea of that there would be this liberalization globally, as information became more available, it would be harder for repressive governments to be repressive. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore. Is that what you're seeing as well?
Yes, correct me if I'm wrong, but at the G20 Osaka, Prime Minister Abe had proposed free data flow with trust in order to balance free data flow and data security. I understand that the governments around the world will start discussing the new framework in response to this declaration. But I believe that the private sector should actively participate in discussion on this framework, not only government, but also private sector. Yeah.
Just on that framework, it's also interesting to note that there were a couple of countries that dissented from the secondary announcement in Japan, in Osaka, which actually tried to direct it towards a plurilateral agreement inside the WTO. And those dissenters that didn't sign on were India and Indonesia, two big G20 economies. And yeah, I mean, you know, there is a backslide. In some ways, it's interesting to hear some of the rhetoric being put out there in places like India, where they talk about grievances like data colonialism and this pushback on the sort of the concept that American companies dominate. But it's not just India. I mean, even Japan's antitrust regulator is looking at big data companies, like we're doing here. And so, you know, that concern around the concentration of control is also driving some of this policy making in various countries. And it's not just in Asia, but in Africa, Latin America.
Very good. We've got some questions here. Maybe I see we've got a lot of anonymous questions, which obviously because people are worried that they're listening to this around the world. Let's start with do the U.S.-China relations make a difference in this environment? Or are internet governance issues the same as before? Do you see differences in ITU, WTO? And let me just note, and I think Shane actually alluded to this before, with China today, the past couple of days with Facebook and Twitter taking down some of the Chinese origin content about Hong Kong. The Chinese Foreign Ministry today came after Facebook and Twitter, saying that, in fact, it's their right to be able to put out their version of what's going on, even if they're using these other tools. Do you see, how do you all see this? And Fiona, perhaps you could start off.
Absolutely. I mean, the environment, and whether it's a ITU environment where it's a traditional multilateral conversation, or WTO, we're doing plurilateral agreements sometimes. The U.S.-China dynamic is always one that people watch, but equally as important is the U.S.-European relationship and how allied blocs work together. So this definitely has an impact. And I think, again, as sort of the middle group of countries struggle to sort of solve these problems, they look to see how people sort things out. And I think when the U.S. and the European member states aren't agreeing, which happens on some of these issues, it makes it more challenging for people because they're not quite sure where to go. So definitely there's an impact there.
All right. Jane, it looked like you wanted to jump in.
I think a lot of it, we're all following what's going on with the Huawei situation, and it's just brought a lot of things to light. I think the internet itself always it brings things to the speed of light that we've had dialogues on for a long time. It's how much do we trust each other? And now that we're in this interconnected world, and there are elements of distrust that we're not so sure about, especially when a lot of this is being kept by the security teams. I always say I talk to, we probably all do talk to a lot of spooks, and I just have to believe that they have a reason why they're concerned about China having too much power via hardware. That may solve itself as we get into more software applications, as we're seeing things change. You mentioned 5G earlier. Just the whole idea of how the network and networks is going to work. And trust is always a tough thing. I mean, the internet was built on trust. Fiona kind of alluded to that earlier. It was innate in how it was designed. And now we're starting to be trust but verify. We also have the constant tension between security and privacy, and that the best privacy really starts with a zero tolerance, and you have to build yourself into the system. And we have a 30-year system that we have assumed trust. So I think we have some very interesting discussions ahead of us.
Yeah, and let me ask, we talk about this increased sensitivity about this, and there was discussion over the past day or so, obviously, about 5G. Do you see part of the sensitivity here? In the past, cybersecurity really had to do with sort of the impact on individuals. That is, whether or not your financial information or your medical information, how secure is it? Was there problems associated with individuals and small groups? With 5G promising, at least in theory, to change the entire way in which economies operate, where everything is interconnected, is that what's driving the increased sensitivity about whether it's Chinese equipment or others, the fact that an entire economy could be at risk, not just personal data? Chris?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'd say that's the one area where you see even governments, take the Singapore example, regulating on cybersecurity for critical information in industry. And their concern is that there could be a cyber attack that could take down the energy grid, that could take down the healthcare system. They were the subject of a big cyber hack, and the Prime Minister's own information was stolen last year. So yeah, as our economies become more and more digitized, there's the increasing concern that cybersecurity is going to be a defining issue. And you're then seeing this play out at the political level as well. As I mentioned, you take IoT. I had seen that China was actually sponsoring a set of IoT network security workshops alongside the APEC meetings. So, they're actually, they want to get their perspective on how to manage IoT security. And then you're seeing, to the Russia question, Russia pushing hard at the UN for a separate new process. Previously, the group of government experts had been handling most of the cybersecurity matters out of First Committee in New York. And this past year, Russia pushed hard for a separate open-ended working group to also discuss cybersecurity issues, because I think they see it as an area, as I said, it's ascendant in terms of being a wedge issue, and one that if you can get more and more countries on board with your approach, it both legitimizes your approach and makes it more relevant in the world.
Fiona?
So I think the China Huawei stuff has come up a lot in a couple different ways. And so while I'm not the best person to speak for the current administration and sort of what's happening and the dynamics around all of it, I would just offer the following observation that China passed last year a cybersecurity law that's now in effect. And in that cybersecurity law, any Chinese company has to comply with the request from the Chinese government to give them information or data without question. And there's no rule of law in China to appeal that. So when you're in a system where regardless of the relationship between the companies and the Communist Party and the country, and you can argue different elements of that, but when you have a law that says if we ask for something, anything, you will give it to us without question, and there's no way for those companies, regardless of their intent, to want to appeal that, of course you're going to have a problem. That's my one observation on that set of issues.
It's worth noting too, Fiona, though, that countries like Australia are also pushing forward with government access to data. So they had an access and encryption law that went rapidly through in a 2-week window last December that essentially mandates the same thing. The government can request data on encrypted systems, and if the company says they can't actually access the encryption, then the government can request it's a higher threshold to say, well, you have to find a way, you have to build a new way. Now, I think the difference is
China's
that
not Australia in terms of rule of law.
That's true, and the difference there does surround due process that stands behind the law. But then companies have a lot of questions on the Australian side of, well, what are the actual specifics here? Does it give too much authority to the regulator to determine what is a systemic threat if you were to give like an encryption key to the government? But the broader political thing is I thought I would be advising clients about China and its access to data, and instead it's helping them navigate the Australian government. And that's interesting in the fact that they're two very different political polar opposites in a way.
Well, not only opposite in terms of the things that Fiona talked about, but President Xi in his speeches late last year and earlier this year has made it clear that the law in China is to serve the purposes of the Chinese Communist Party, which should, I think, give everybody some pause. Not only do you have the questions about rule of law generally, but the focus of that rule of law that does exist is perhaps different than many would assume. As we start to wrap up, one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is this movement that we have seen over the past couple of years to completely have governments completely shut down the internet in their country. We see that right now in Kashmir, for example, in India. You know, the world's largest democracy just shuts it off. Now, I will say that not only the internet there, but they've also shut off telephone service and others. But we've seen this around the world, sometimes for just short periods of time, sometimes for longer periods of time. And when you have societies dependent on the internet, as we've been talking about, that has to have a huge impact on individuals as well as economies. How do you see that playing into this whole Humpty Dumpty problem of an internet that is not uniform and ubiquitous?
Single point of failure is always a problem. When you've got one country, when a country is running their own infrastructure and they can choose to cut people off. I know, like, when my cell phone goes out, I have a combination of relief and claustrophobia. I mean, it's like part of me is like, okay, maybe I can just have a minute to breathe. And then you're like, wait a minute, what am I not getting right now that's going to be going on? And I think, you know, for people that are trying to build, you know, small businesses or any business off the ability to use digital tools, that's a very frightening idea that you could just cleave off what is allowing them to make an income.
Chris?
Yeah, so, you know, what I think is happening in Kashmir is truly important, not just for the tech side of it, but, you know, we're also hearing stories from government officials who say, you know, false information is spreading around my city. And I was listening to she was a police chief from a smaller city in India, and saying, you know, there was this message going around that a Muslim had killed a Hindu man, and there had to be some type of retribution, and it was fake, and it actually never happened. But it was moving so quickly, and they had no way to manage the disinformation that was promulgating across the city, and they literally had to go door to door, the police, to say, hey, this isn't happening. So, you know, those are the types of, I'm not saying that, you know, shutting down the internet is the way to go, but those are the types of challenges some of these governments are facing, and they're trying to figure out, or how do we kind of manage that type of disinformation? And that's a different situation, obviously, than Kashmir or other places where they've done it, I think, much more for political purposes as opposed to stopping mob violence. But, you know, those are legitimate questions that I think will dominate how this discussion advances.
Fiona?
So I think we've talked a lot about the economics of things, but when a country, and it's appalling that India has decided to do what it's done, but someone shuts down internet access in a country or in a region, you're not just impacting the economics, you are impacting businesses, but you're impacting the hospital and healthcare and social things that are happening to people. So it's got to not be the answer to how to deal with these problems. So again, back to what's causing the problems and how do you actually deal with the underlying issues versus just instinctively turning off communication flows.
Well, we're at the end of our time. I think it's important, though, that we end on a more positive note than all, since we have focused so much on the problems, which is fairly typical of this. But it seems to me remarkable. It was only a few years ago when we had panels like this that the focus of this panel would be what can we do to bring more people onto the internet, and how incredibly important that was. Now we have more than half of the world on the internet, which is more than has sanitation and a variety of other basic needs. And now we're into how do we keep it going, and how do we maximize it, and how do we make sure that the benefits are fully and fairly shared globally. There's a certain positive underlying message, it seems to me, even with all the problems that this panel has been so expert in discussing. I'd like to have us all thank this panel very much in the traditional fashion.